Overwatch League 2022 has come and gone, and with a busy offseason quickly approaching, now seems like a great time to just take a breather and do some reflection. Lots of interesting storylines and lessons were learned in a fun and exciting new era. But what thing stood out more than others for all 20 franchises? Let's talk about that. Here is one thing that I learned about every Overwatch League team from the 2022 season. How about we go from bottom to top in the overall standings, which means that first up is the Paris Eternal. The big takeaway for them is that magic is never meant to last. 2020 and 2021 both saw Paris be exciting for different reasons, of course. Last year in particular was pretty cool because they developed a bunch of young talent into a respectable group in spite of their little expectations. While they weren't going to be world beaters in this year, they were still supposed to be decent on the surface. It was the same team as last year, but with a few additional pieces. But when it came down to it, Paris were overdue for a bad year. They lost their amazing head coach, Get Amazed, and they just couldn't seem to keep up. Things were unraveling at the seams, and as a result, players that made last year's team so special were all dropping like flies. And fast forward just a couple of months later into the year, and not a single member from the original roster was left. They literally ditched everyone and had one of the worst years in Overwatch League history. It was a season to forget in the land of Paris, and I can't help but worry about their future and what it has in store for them. They are supposedly sticking with this core they had at the end of this year, so I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens. Either way, a team with budget issues and a disappointing year has a lot of work cut out for them. The alexyOWL. You feel lost. Oh man, how the times have changed. The alexyOWL used to be a model organization, but since their original core left them in 2020, things have gotten progressively worse, and this year might have been their breaking point. Your experiment of building a team around Yaki and Flora was a complete disaster. I really feel bad for Yaki. He was still a solid player this year, but another year of his prime got completely wasted. He needed help, and he practically got none. I'm beginning to wonder if management even knows how to build a team. Their last two products were a disgrace compared to their original core. Maybe they really did just luck into a talented roster in the inaugural season. It's clear that this current core is not the answer, and that they might need to hit the reset button. New roster, new coaching, new everything. A new approach simply needs to happen. They really need a brand new era over there. It's time to get a grip, New York, because your fans are getting very rowdy. The Vancouver Titans. There's finally a light. Okay, so in retrospect, the Titans did not have a special year. In fact, they didn't win a game until the Summer Showdown. They were mostly uncompetitive and clearly lacked the star power to compete. However, the second half of this year maybe gave us some hope. They made their first tournament in 2 years and at least kind of made an effort to get a play-in spot. They changed up their coaching and management situations and now finally have some potential pieces to build around in King and Aspire. If they only managed to hold on to D-Pay at the end of this year, things would be looking pretty good and on the up. Regardless, this was a year with some improvement. I like that they have new management, I like that they have a few young and exciting pieces. Now it's just a matter of building on that and not going backwards, which is scary to think about because it is the Titans, but maybe, just maybe, this will be the time where things finally turn around. Progress is progress. The Los Angeles Valiant. You need new management ASAP. I don't know how much can be done about this, but I really do hope the Valiant can escape who is currently controlling them behind the scenes. Players were not getting the resources they needed this year. Their pay was coming through sketchy manners at times, and their living conditions were not ideal. In spite of that, the Valiant were in contention to be a part of the playoffs until the last week of the regular season, and it goes to show that they were well coached and actually had some decent talent. They almost overcame the odds in spite of everything being against them. This team was not expected to do much at all, but they still had a few win streaks and upsets. They were a pain in the neck for just about every team in the East. I fully expected this team to barely win anything, so the fact that they won 7 matches is a pleasant surprise. It was really awesome to see familiar faces like Marvel and Dia do well, but also some bright young new faces like EasyHan and Becky. The Valiant might have a decent team, and if they can improve behind the scenes a little bit and maybe tidy up during the offseason, they might just have something here. The Chengdu Hunters. Money ruins everything. Oh, how quickly the mighty can fall when their wallets are crying. Chengdu had a solid roster from top to bottom at the beginning of this offseason, but their parent company just wasn't making any money. They pretty much had no choice but to try and make some quick bucks back by selling a lot of their players and dropping others. I mean, genuinely, before the drops, they had a solid healer rotation, an interesting hit scan prospect to make their DPS feel more well-rounded, and in general seemed very exciting. But they basically lost all of that instantly, most notably being the departures of Xerneas and Aprita. And it doesn't really help that Wrecking Ball wasn't all that viable either during this regular season, and they got exposed for it. The Hunters generally lacked the comfort and flexibility to keep up with the high-level teams of the league. Every single tournament felt like the exact same thing. 2-4 stage after 2-4 stage. The Hunters were so painfully mediocre, and it's really disappointing. And with the future being more uncertain than ever before right now, Chengdu fans could be in for a really awful offseason. The Guangzhou Charge. It's not how you start, but how you finish. The Charge are the prime example of what it looks like to get rewarded for not throwing in the towel. If we're being honest, they were dead to right after the midseason madness. 1 victory in 12 tries and an 11-game losing streak all but put them out of playoff contention. But instead of throwing in the towel, they made the right changes. They wanted to put up a fight. They wanted to go down swinging if they were going to lose. So they threw away the things that were not working, and they brought in guys that actually wanted to win. And the result we got was one of the greatest short season turnarounds in recent memory, because an 8-4 finish gave this team some serious hope. They have promising players across the board, and what once felt like a worthless season has turned into a potential worthwhile future investment. They ultimately fell short of their goal of making the playoffs, but the fact that they got so close after digging such a big hole is incredible. And this, my friends, is why you never give up. The Charge are a prime example of what it looks like to be rewarded for your efforts. The Boston Uprising. Something has to change. Alright, Boston, you've tried to play around this general core the last 2 years, and it just has not worked out. Now with the coaching changes, the management changes, and the recent acquisition of MAG from the Washington Justice, it's time to try and get a different outlook for what your team can be heading into the future. Because from what we've seen the last 2 years, it's just not worth investing in what you have currently. We've seen the same movie. A team that's just, okay. Someone who's not going to be a threat, but will always do just enough to not completely fade into irrelevance. Playing around those guys you got from WGS is not the play. You got rid of the coach, and now I think it's time to get rid of the players. You can sit there and say guys like Valentine and Faith have potential, but Boston have not made the playoffs since 2018. It gets to a point where you just have to make a move. We're not seeing enough progress fast enough, so you have to make a change. There is an influx of new talent on the way. Now is the time to take a risk. Build around your tanks and even Crimzo. This team has some talent. You don't have to start over completely. Just make a few moves and suddenly you might be surprisingly decent. The Washington Justice. Life's very unfair. It really sucks to go through what the Justice did. They were genuinely a decent team, even with a pretty suspect support line. The efforts of their DPS and MAG were kind of doing the trick for them to hang around, but then it suddenly got thrown away almost completely mid-season because of some issues behind the scenes. They almost lost everything, that's insane to me. And even then, they still managed to be competitive without that flexibility factor, and their promising talent that they acquired at tank and support. It's a shame that they lost the other guys that they had, because they actually would have had a decent shot of making the playoffs had they stayed. It's concerning that the folks in charge of this franchise no longer see reason to invest. They wanted to trade away all of it just to save a quick buck or two, and I'm willing to bet they would have gotten rid of everybody if they had a bit more time before the trade deadline. It's obvious that next year is going to see a lot of new faces unless something suddenly changes. This could be a really garbage way to end the decay in Washington era. There was so much promise 3 years ago when he joined, and almost nothing came out of it. I'm so sorry, Justice fans, I really am, because this was not where you were promised, and now your future is very much up in the air. The Hangzhou Spark. Shy can only carry you so far. Let's just call it how it is. The Spark had their moments in the spotlight where it felt like everybody was contributing. but for whatever the reason, they picked and chose when to play at that kind of level. The Spark were genuinely respectable in the first half of this year, but then suddenly they started flopping uncontrollably and nobody had the confidence anymore. That wonderful team play turned into the Shy Show. I don't know if it was a coaching thing, miscommunication, an inability to be flexible enough. I don't know exactly what it was, but a lot of the time it felt like they could not even win a fight without Shy. And even in the playoffs, it still felt like that to a certain extent. Now, to be fair, Shy is freaking awesome, and a bunch of other guys did have their moments to shine, but it's just not enough still. Their horrible record in the second half of this year and their ups and downs is unacceptable. They were able to heat up in the playoffs, which is really good, of course, but how much of that is luck-based? Let's say the meta did not end up changing so drastically. Would they have even sniffed the top 4 of the playoffs? I'd argue no. Just imagine if you turned the Spark into a well-oiled machine. Please get on the Spark. You have so much promise. You placed the highest you have since 2019, which is a great step in the right direction, but you cannot be satisfied. You must continue to improve. If you pair Shy up with a true superstar, the Spark are going to wreak havoc. The Toronto Defiant. Nobody will be mid forever. Congrats, Defiant fans, your team has finally done something that's more than average in a year. Record-wise, they weren't very special, but they actually played well when it mattered for once. Giving Hisu a solid foundation at support plus a resurgent Hoppa really did the trick. This team couldn't always be taken lightly for once. Seeing them go far in their own tournament and actually nabbing 3rd place in it was a wonderful sight. But the fact that they also made the playoffs for the first time is an amazing step in the right direction. They were genuinely respectable, and for once it seems like they finally have a core to build around. For the first time ever, it doesn't feel like they actually are going to hit that reset button. Toronto fans might be able to rest easy for the first time in their lives. A lot of positive accomplishments warrant excitement heading into their future. Time to make use of that budget, Toronto. Hisu, Twilight, and Chorong are all promising pieces. Now just give them a bit more help and you're gonna go very far. The Philadelphia Fusion. Nobody deals with adversity better than you do. Honestly, my expectations were not that high for Philly. I saw a world where they could still get top 3 in the East, but it was mostly due to a lack of faith in their competition. It seemed more like they'd stumble here rather than earn it. So many terrible things were happening all at once. The unfortunate passing of Alarm, God rest his soul, Funny Astro moving on, the Fusion tank situation getting worse. It all had you wondering if they'd even have what it takes to be a threat. It seemed like the downfall of the Fusion franchise might finally be upon us. Could a suspect support line and a bunch of inexperienced rookies lead this team to victory? Well, as it turns out, yes. Yes, they could. In particular, the new DPS duo of MM3 and Zest had something to say about this, as they quickly took the world by storm as a powerful 1-2 punch. There was a lot of question marks and ups and downs during this year, but when it mattered, their experience never got the best of them. To make all 3 tournaments and the playoffs with the world against them is remarkable. And in every single tournament, aside from the playoffs, they genuinely had their moments where they looked really scary. Philly were a tough cookie. After all Philly fans have gone through during the previous offseason, I was happy to see their team give them something exciting to root for. It didn't end so hot in the playoffs, of course, but there's something to build towards at least. They have some bright young stars, and if you give them a bit more help, then I promise you that the new era in Philly is going to be a bright one. Enjoy this ride, Fusion fans. I get the feeling that the future is going to be very fun. The Florida Mayhem. Sometimes we have to move on to achieve something greater. For me, the Mayhem were a giant question mark during the preseason. They let go of the very core that gave them the only success and relevance they have known up until this point. Could they still really be good without Yaki and the boys? Was it really worth saying goodbye after just one bad year? Well, as it turns out, yes. Yes, it was. In fact, moving on was the smartest thing Florida could have ever done in retrospect. New coaching and more motivated players was the exact thing they needed to get back on track. They took a chance on a mixed roster full of a lot of rookies, mind you, and they benefited greatly. They have a lot of rising stars over there. Hydron, Someone, RuPaul, and Sir Majed all had fantastic rookie showings, and my boy Checkmate had a sick redemption arc on DPS. All of their combined efforts led to 3 tournament appearances and a playoff berth with no real expectations. And the best part is, they were genuinely a scary underdog with a couple of clutch feats. They weren't always incredible during the regular season, but they always did enough to get by. They'd use those failures as well as learning lessons, and they'd get better for the games that truly mattered. Really impressive stuff from a team that's so young. Florida's rebuild is very much ahead of schedule, and I look forward to seeing what's next. The London Spitfire. Looks can be deceiving. Boy, do I feel silly about this one. I was so confident that London would suck. It's the same players basically, I said. They lack the star power, I said. But in reality, I was just fixated on the past. It was a new year, a new game, and a new team, and London were an actual powerhouse. They started the year off as just a really strong rush team that nobody could match, but it quickly developed into something way more. Sparker and Backbone realized their potential. The support line was a lot more reliable. The coaching was better. And most importantly, Hadi improved like crazy. Behind his leadership and reliable play, London had a star to play around. But also, they had an identity. They forced us to take them seriously with one of the most out-of-nowhere seasons in recent memory. The Spitfire had stars and the confidence to go far. From one of the supposed worst-performing teams in scrims during the preseason to a playoff team. Based on their role star and coach of the year selections, plus their high finish in the playoffs, it's safe to say that the Spitfire massively overachieved. What they accomplished this year is special. Props to their coaching and management for making this all possible. London had their first good season in years, and it's definitely worth celebrating, but don't get satisfied, London fans. Let's see them do it again. The Atlanta Reign. No Pelican equals big problem. From a general standpoint, Atlanta did fine this year. They managed to make the playoffs for the 4th consecutive year, and even had a few decent tournaments on top of that. But as the season dragged on, it felt like they were doing less and less and less, and they proceeded to have their worst playoff performance to date on top of it. It felt like they were missing something, and that's where they ended up really missing Pelican, I feel. He was the guy that kept them all together back in the day. They depended on him through his playmaking and flexibility. Without that serious superstar X factor, Atlanta just could not push the top teams anymore. However, if there's any good news that comes out of this, it's that this was just year one of what looks to be a young and promising roster. The supports, as well as Speedily, are filled to the brim with potential. Another year of growth and maybe a couple of roster changes, and the Reign could be a lot better. It was a downgrade of a year compared to 2021, but this could be the foundation year for something that's a lot more special. Don't worry, Atlanta fans, there's still hope for you even without Pelican. The Houston Outlaws. Even the saddest stories get better eventually. It took 5 long years, but Outlaws fans finally have a solid product to be truly proud of. This year was filled with first for the Outlaws. Dante looking good on a new role, having stars at both damage spots for once, and even making the playoffs. Up until now, the Outlaws have never made the playoffs before, so the fact that they did this much is an accomplishment all on its own, but then they decided to mess around and get 3rd place. I mean, wow, this is a year to really be excited about. There were ups and downs for sure, especially in some of those early tournaments, but they played well when it mattered in the postseason, which is the most important takeaway. It gave Outlaws fans something they haven't felt in quite some time. Hope. Even if Pelican were to leave this team, you have a bright young star in Merit to build your future around. Houston are arguably in the best shape they've been in heading into an offseason. The futures may be a little uncertain still, but for now, Outlaws fans can celebrate a year well done. The Shanghai Dragons. The 2-year window curse is very real. While the Dragons certainly weren't bad this year, they were still kind of a shell of their former selves. We saw a glimpse of what they were capable of at their peaks during the Summer Showdown, but that's about it. For a team that just won a championship last year, this is a little disappointing. Outside of one meta, it was oftentimes the lip show, as he tried to do everything he could to carry his teammates, but a lot of those other guys did not want it as much. Players such as Fate and Fleta have not looked the same recently, and the sad truth is, this might mean the end of an era. The Dragons' title window might have just come to a close. 2020 and 2021 was their best opportunity. I mean, even the best teams we've ever seen actually get worse after that 2-year time frame or so. Long-term success in this league is tough to come by. Look at the Shock of old before they moved on to Proper and what we see today. They followed the exact same path. They won 2 titles in a row, and then they fell behind last year. The best teams only last 2 to 3 years at most. And with rumored retirements on the way for Shanghai, this Dragons team really could be done. It might be time for a rebuild. It's a sad reality to face, but it looks like it's the end of an era for one of the most successful franchises in Overwatch history. The Seoul Dynasty. Coaching and a new tank make all the difference. While it didn't end with them hoisting up the Grand Finals trophy, Seoul's season was a major success and improvement compared to 2021. And a big reason it was all possible was because they made the executive decision to improve their weak points. Coaching costed them dearly so many times back in the day. They swapped to Toby though this year, and the results speak for themselves. And then we have Tank on top of that, right? Going from Gesture and Marvel to Smurf was night and day. See what happens when you acquire an actual star at the tank position instead of settling for mediocrity? Just swapping to Smurf put Seoul on a completely different trajectory. His explosiveness, his flexibility, his synergy with Prophet. For once, Tank did not feel like a liability. And look at how they did as a result, right? Number 1 in the East, their first ever tournament trophy, multiple MVP candidates. Literally, this one signing alone solved a bunch of problems. This was the most enjoyable year, in my opinion at least, for a Seoul fan by far. There was no grand finals appearance or anything, but there was a lot of progress and more consistency overall. And so long as they stay intact, this core is going to be a contender always. I promise you that. The Los Angeles Gladiators. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Okay, LA, I have a lot of mixed feelings about your year. On one hand, you generally were pretty solid. A title contender throughout, multi-time champions, multiple MVP level players, the Glads had a solid year. But at the same time, it felt like it could have been a lot more, as it felt like they used up a lot of their good performances way too early on. They struggled big time in the Summer Showdown, and it became pretty apparent that their DPS line was getting less flexible over time, largely in thanks to the Patty Pan retirement. And then we follow up by them looking pretty bad when it mattered the most during the playoffs. They simply looked unprepared and kinda burnt out. The meta, of course, has to do with their failures, like with some other teams, but that should not be an excuse when you boast this much talent. The Gladiators ran out of steam, and their mentals were boomed. They used up all their energy in like 3 months worth of time. This team ended up finishing even worse in the playoffs than they did last year, despite being arguably better on paper. And now we're left here wondering how much longer this core has left together. Their primes are being wasted here, and with this kind of talent, you should be shooting for the stars. Do better. The San Francisco Shock. You have the brightest future of any team. It amazes me just how good the Shock were this year. This team literally just started over. They moved on from their championship core for a brand new roster full of rookies, and yet it felt like the Shock of old never even left us. Meme on them all you want for getting second place in 3 separate tournaments, but that is really good for a brand new team like this. A team so young was already scaring everybody in the league, and it's largely thanks to one man. And of course, he goes by the name of Proper. He is easily the best player in the world right now. The year he had is something we likely will never see again. If this keeps up, he might end up being the GOAT of our esports someday. And this was his first year, for crying out loud. Just imagine what the Shock could have done if he had a better supporting cast. It is a horrifying thought when considering the wealth of talent they have just waiting around the corner with their academy team. You know, that same academy team that gave us Proper and Finn and Kilo and is arguably the most dominant contenders team in Overwatch history? Yeah, that team. Year 1 of a new era in San Francisco was extremely successful, and it can only get better from here as they build around Proper more. The other 19 franchises are once again crying in agony, wondering why life has to be this unfair. The Dallas Fuel. The cycle of misery is officially broken. Well, Dallas fans, you finally got your promise fulfilled. This franchise that was supposed to be competing for a crown 5 years ago now is finally sitting on top of the world, and they did so in dominant fashion. They had the best record in the league, they won a tournament, and then they locked in big time for the playoffs. After falling short in 2021, they finally got it done. They got their missing pieces at main support and hit scan, and they never looked back. Behind the brilliance of Hanbin and the comeback story of Edison, the fuel rolled through just about everybody in their way and got extremely hot in the second half of this year. And what I appreciate is they always found ways to bounce back whenever there was some sort of shortcoming. They made adjustments consistently, and the players were making sacrifices for the good of the team. The hive mind was certainly in full effect. And unlike some of their competition, they saved their energy for when it really mattered late into this year. That is when they flipped the switch while everybody else was exhausted. Their eyes were on the prize, and they were going to do whatever it took. They wanted that thing so badly, and they definitely earned it. They locked in, man. I mean, seriously. Cheers to them for having all of that hard work pay off. This title was very deserved, and I'm excited to see what's next. Enjoy the moment, Dallas fans. It's been a long time coming. The cycle is finally over. And on that note, that's going to wrap up the 20th team. Overwatch League 2022 sure was awesome, wasn't it? So much ended up happening, and there were a lot of different takeaways, so let me know what you learned about your favorite team down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video and you want more content just like it, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you're new. And until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.